I'm Beth Paraso, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech's Tragedy of the Commons. Today, my guest is Toby Langell. Welcome, Toby.
Hello, thank you for having me.
He is Principal and Managing Partner at Unlock Open, a consulting firm in Geneva that advises clients on working with the open tech ecosystem. Langell is a passionate advocate for funding open source development. In February, he gave a presentation at the State of Open conference in London, urging funding for open source maintainers. So, Toby, let's talk about the problem here first. Why do you think we've reached a point where issues with open source sustainability persist?
I think there are different ways to look at the problem. The short answer is basic economics, which is that markets are good at certain things and not good at others. And typically, managing and maintaining commons is something that markets are not designed to do well or properly. And so, to some degree, increasingly, I'm becoming of the opinion that the problem of open source sustainability is baked in sort of like fundamentals, and that the fact that we have this problem is just it took us some amount of time to realize this and start addressing that problem as we do addressing commons management in general. And increasingly, I'm getting of the opinion that this is where governments have to step in because markets are just not designed to do that. So I think there's a tricky bit here, which is unlike not all commons management problem, but unlike many, open source is international. It crosses your usual jurisdiction barriers. And so as a result, we need to sort of like figure out a way of getting governments to step in and support this ecosystem and do so in a way where different countries collaborate together to do so. That's the additional twist. And to be honest, I've only arrived at this conclusion fairly recently. And I would say that the talk that you just mentioned in London, I specifically avoided that specific question. And it's only as a result of having done that talk and having confronted the state of the world and my understanding of the world and the broader community that it really dawned on me that the real underlying problem was this one, and that the only solution would be governmental.
So, what do you think about open source vendors changing licensing terms to fund open source development? Is that also part of your thinking or a separate conversation?
So I think that this is an important problem, and it would be silly not to notice the trends and the ecosystem around this. It's an important consideration, but I think it's an entirely different problem than the problem of maintenance of the existing ecosystem. Frankly, my perspective is that a lot of businesses go into trying to monetize an open source project and kind of do it the wrong way around. The reason we're seeing a lot of companies change their licensing terms and try to monetize open source projects in the way that they have done is because they weren't designed as businesses from the get-go, or if they were, they weren't designed intentionally in a way that was customer and product focused, and they're struggling to actually monetize the software that they have, which they were giving away for free. And also the fact that a lot of them have taken a lot of investments forced them to create returns and capture value in the market that they can't just do that easily with the existing licenses that they have. But it's kind of a separate problem. And I think that regardless of what these companies decide to do with the software that they produce, the question of supporting open source as a whole remains. And I also would like to add that I believe that there's lots of different ways that are collectively going to get together to make the ecosystem more sustainable. Depending on the project, depending on the audience of the project, depending if it's very much a vertical, very horizontal, how high up in the stack it is, etc., you're going to get different ways to monetize or fund or support a project. Typically, the closer you are to the end user, the easier it is to actually build products around it and monetize it. The lower in the stack, the harder it is, up to the point where you are sufficiently close to compute where then suddenly cloud players are actually more involved. So, it's this complex stuff. And I don't think there's one solution. And I think it would be a mistake to think that there's one solution. But I do believe that there is this large open ecosystem in the middle there that needs outside support that it's not getting right now. And that won't be solved through market, as I was saying earlier. And also, that is very different than the kind of we're having trouble monetizing an open source project as a business kind of problem.
Along those lines, in your talk, you drew a distinction between open source developers and open source maintainers. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you take that approach?
Yes, this is also a distinction that I've been able to reason about fairly recently, and that to me solves a problem that was kind of blocking me from actually saying the ecosystem needs funding. One of the things that open source practitioners tend to agree about is that there is a lot of value in the fact that a lot of open source is driven by engineers solving their own problems and scratching their own itch, is the way we talk about
Yeah.
this. And essentially doing so in a very constrained way, in a way that breeds innovation and the hacking culture of software development, trying to solve problems in fast and smart and creative ways. And it is true that once you start funding the innovation engine, there are risks of getting into development that is no longer really designed to solve specific itches that you're scratching, but build features and essentially sell software. And so a lot of people in the past have talked about bringing money to open source would be damaging. And usually what they're talking about is specifically this. It would be damaging to this sort of culture and open source way of coming together to solve problems. So making that separation, making that distinction between the development, the innovation aspect of creating software together and the maintenance of software once it's created helps kind of see what part makes sense using this volunteer driven way of working and what part actually needs support of a different kind.
Hmm.
So I think that's why it's a very useful tool to reason about the ecosystem and its needs. And again, it's subtle. The overlap between innovation and maintenance is large, and the same roles switch from one to another on a regular basis, right?
Right.
But I think that it caters to a different maturity of software. It caters to different relationship to building. But it's like the pioneers, settler, town planner. There's lots of different metaphors of this craftsperson moving into industrialization. And all of these, they sort of call for different models, different ways of working, different culture, and also just different people.
Hmm.
To me, this is a tool that really helps reason about this and make the distinction and see how we can preserve the innovation aspects of open source while at the same time fund the maintenance and the fact that people can use it securely and safely.
And you made the point in your talk that paying $1 billion or even $10 billion to open source maintainers per year would be just a small fraction of what companies are paying for software development already. But the Linux Foundation and OpenSSF, along with the White House, to your point about governments, called for an investment in open source software supply chain security in 2022. Their goal was $150 million, and they haven't gotten close yet. So, how do you go from recognizing that need and making that ask to actually persuading companies and government to make that investment?
The 1 billion number, and I think you do mention that I say 10 billion in my talk. The more I do the math, the more I'm like, yeah, it should be 10 billion, not one.
Mm,
So, just because I think it's interesting, the math behind this is if you look at roughly the amount of professional developers in the world, the latest IDC data points at 16 million developers in the world.
mm,
And you do a rough average using average salary, it's between 65 and 85, I think, from what I remember of the numbers. Anyway, roughly speaking, if you do the math around this, you realize that the industry spends $1 trillion a year on the loaded cost of software developers. And so 0.1% of $1 trillion
yeah.
is 1 billion. And if you compare this with the amount of open source software that's part of the stack, like the data says around 75 to 80% of an application is open source, you come to the realization that we find it crazy to ask for 0.1% of the yearly spend on software development
Hmm.
to support and maintain 80% of applications. And that doesn't make any sense. And so, really, what my talk was about was to say this: there's this huge discrepancy here, and we have to at least start acknowledging it and start as a community and as an industry understand the size of the problem and put a dollar amount on what it's going to cost to actually solve it if we want to be reasonable at the requirements. So, your question is about how do we actually find that money?
Yeah.
And when I gave the talk, my answer was I'm specifically not going to talk about this.
Sure.
And now, as a follow up of conversations I've had since, my answer is commons have to be funded by governments because markets don't solve the problem. Hence, this is going to have to be paid for by governments through taxation.
Hmm.
What exactly that taxation, what form that taxation actually takes, I don't know.
Hmm.
But at the same time, if you're talking about 0.1% of software cost, I'm sure we already have a bunch of taxes for things that would seem menial in comparison to the importance and value of this whole open supply chain. So I think governments will increasingly move towards funding this because they can't, on one hand, be producing policies and regulation around the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU. The Biden administration did something similar in the US. So you can't have, on one hand, conformance, compliance, regulation, and requirements put on the industry that is based on essentially volunteers doing work that they're just essentially going to stop doing if no one's paying them to do it and if it becomes a requirement, and just cross your fingers and hope for the best. It's like not going to solve the compliance problems, right? It's not going to solve the problems that the governments are actually trying to solve.
Hmm.
The bigger picture here is, and I've been banging on that drum for a while, you cannot solve security of the supply chain if you don't talk about sustainability of the supply chain. And so at some point, you're going to have to make the call as a government of, well, we want security, then we have to pay for it.
Well, then, so the government pays it, but then who's the recipient? Would that be something like the Linux Foundation or CNCF that distributes that to the maintainers?
So that's another very good question. The way I see this, again, we're not going to have one size fits all solutions.
Right.
I tend to prefer distributed solutions because there's obviously an added cost to having anything that's distributed with more players, but it also comes with more resilience and more flexibility. So I'm assuming different ecosystems, different programming languages, different culture will want different solutions.
Mm.
But what I'm expecting is a mix of for profit, not for profit, and leveraging the existing foundations to essentially support people doing maintenance work.
Right.
And so funding maintainers probably through a combination of for profits and nonprofits,
Okay.
and possibly through existing foundations. And I think this is going to solve a really interesting problem, which is that a lot of people love working on open source and love being invested and can't really spend as much time as they would want to be able to do. And a lot of their work is actually maintenance work.
Mm.
And so, what I'm expecting such a solution could do mid to long term is essentially enable people to work part time jobs or full time if they want, doing maintenance of projects that they are actually invested in and that they're actually maybe contributing to in their own time.
Hmm.
And so you keep this balance. And I think it's also going to open the tech industry to people who want to be part of tech,
Hmm.
but do not necessarily want to have a big tech or corporate job.
Mm.
And so essentially enable funding a lot of the creative counter subculture that is part of this ecosystem and that frankly has been struggling for the last decade.
Yeah, I mean, do you think we'll see a shift here? Because it does seem like this conversation is heating up. It seems like people are more aware of this and are talking about it more. So, do you think that we're at a point where things might shift?
Absolutely. I might be wrong, but it's the first time where I think we're starting to articulate the problem in a way that makes sense in the bigger picture and for policymakers and for governments. I think that Log4j, Heartbleed, all of these were incredibly painful events.
Yeah.
But there were also wake up calls. I'm seeing across policymakers a much better understanding of the ecosystem and its importance. It struggles.
Hmm.
Again, to the point I was making before, you can't request compliance from people who are doing this in their free time and hope that this is just going to work out. This is magic thinking.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. And so, even if governments might actually attempt to do magic thinking for a little bit, clearly it's quickly going to come up at a point where they're going to say that this doesn't work.
Well, that's the hope anyway.
I'm not hopeful. I'm fairly confident that this is the only way out.
Uh-huh.
So it's more than hope,
Yeah, something does have to give here. I think that's
right?
definitely what we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think we're going to wrap it up there, but it's been a pleasure talking to you as always, Toby, and
Likewise.
thanks very much for taking the time.
Thank you for bringing up that very important topic and having a conversation about it. It's great. Thank you so much.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 1 Text Tragedy of the Commons. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at bpariso, that's B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R-I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U, at techtarget.com. Please also consider rating, reviewing, or subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about open source